Well, good afternoon everybody, and thank you for taking the time to come to this masterclass on increasing personal resilience. The Health and Safety Executives Labour Force Survey of 2011 and 12 reported that there are over 10 million days lost, working days lost in the UK in that period, directly due to anxiety, stress and depression. And that each incidence of absence on average lasted 24 days. Now we believe that actually there's a hidden cost of stress over and above that reported problem, where there's a degeneration in performance of individuals in organisations because they're experiencing signs of stress. And I don't know whether that's something that you yourself have encountered. So could you just put your hand up if you have encountered someone recently who you would say is demonstrating signs of stress? Okay, sort of made an assumption that's perhaps why you're here. And it may be you, in which case, welcome, okay? So, we've established in the UK itself that stress, anxiety and depression is a problem for the economy. And we also notice this is an issue in organisations, and it's fairly widely reported. In fact, I think a number of the workshops at this event have touched on the same topic. What we also see is actually the cost on the individual and the individual's family and environment of stress, because we do quite a lot of coaching work and we're often given people to help who are in a highly stressed state. But I think one of the things, observation I'd make, is that what we notice is that there's an external general sort of trend of stress that's reported. There's the recession, there's the lack of stability in markets, there are some pretty robust brands and organisations failing. So I think there's an underlying context here of stress and concern, which is perhaps raising people's or diminishing people's tolerance levels. But I think the thing that we notice more acutely is the stress experienced by people in the workplace, which is often created by the leadership or management styles of individuals within the workplace. And in many, many cases, this is unintentional. There are very few cases, I think, when people set out to say, I'm going to make them suffer. Would you agree? Yeah? You may know someone like that and you might want to sort of slap them and things, but actually, a lot of the time it's down to the good old personality clash. Okay. So, nevertheless, whether it's intended or not, people are really experiencing some significant discomfort because of it. Okay. The other thing we notice in different organisations is that there's still a little bit of a tendency for people to see stress as something that, you know, well, if you're feeling a bit anxious, you've got to suck it up and take it on the chin. And that if you're actually demonstrating signs of stress, you might be a bit of a wuss. I don't know whether that's unfair, and apologies to anybody here who thinks I'm being unfair, but we do see pockets of this around the place. So it's really, look, if you're stressed, it's your business and your responsibility to sort it out. Okay. So what we decided to do some time ago was two things. The first thing we decided to do was to try and build a case that was slightly more scientific in order to get people's attention with organisations, particularly people who are data-driven and sort of science-driven. And the second thing we decided to do was to create some very practical tools so that people had some sort of remedies of stress. Over and above, I think, some of the very good work that's already in place, things like employee assistance programs, which enable people with specific sets of circumstances to get support. So this is more in the realms of daily things and daily things in the working environment that may be creating stress for individuals, and hints and tips for how to react to it and respond and sort it out. And the upshot of this really is what we're aiming to do is to unlock that sort of goal of discretionary effort. So I think one of the keynote speakers yesterday suggested that about a third of the workforce is engaged, which of course means that 2/3 have degrees of disengagement. And I think that quite a lot of that 2/3 may well be experiencing some signs of stress. Does that make sense to people? So we've established it's a problem. We've established there's the bit of resistance to taking the problem on board, with individuals and possibly organisationally. And we want something quick and practical and robust to help sort it out. Yep. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mandy. There you are. Okay. We're not going to fight over it. Okay.
So the agenda for today is we're going to look at briefly a bit of the neuroscience behind stress and its impact on you as an individual. Looking at some personal stress triggers and remedies, we've been able to work one-to-one with a few people in the audience already to help them work out what their personal stress triggers are and send them some information afterwards. So if you are interested in doing that, please see us on our stand 7 when this workshop's finished. We're happy to do that with you. We're going to look at how values and beliefs impact stress and help you increase resilience. And we're going to briefly mention some techniques to increase your personal resilience and help you minimise stress, and have a brief question and answer session afterwards. Okay? So moving on to the neuroscience, I'm very briefly going to talk about the structure of the brain. And as I'm doing so, start to think about how this might then have its impact on you and your own experience of stress. So those of you who are familiar with the brain structure, apologies, I'm going to simplify it a little bit, but this is for quickness. So the brain is made up of 3 key structures. The hindbrain, which has to do with our state of arousal, are we awake or asleep? The midbrain is where all our sensory input comes through. It's like the Clapham junction of our sensory input. Not only what we see, hear, touch, taste and smell, but also feedback from our body, from our endocrine system, from our heartbeat, lungs and so on. The forebrain is the brain that's developed later in our development, which is where we do our multisensory processing, our higher activities such as planning, thinking ahead, visioning and so on. And only 2% of that at the front of our brain is actually conscious working memory. So with 98% of our brain operating outside our conscious awareness, and this is where we start to experience the symptoms of stress. So you can quite see that we're not going to be consciously aware necessarily that we are feeling stressed. And that's sometimes where it's hard to spot the symptoms. Okay. And the brain is fueled by glucose and oxygen. So that's why sometimes if you have a quick sugar drink, you get a quick hit of energy. Or if you're not drinking enough water, you might find yourself getting tired. So those are quick remedies for stress. So moving on to how the brain works, you can start to see how when you are in a stress state, sometimes this will have an impact on your performance fairly quickly, and over time it has a long-term impact on performance. So the brain is made up of billions and billions of cells called neurons, which are connected together, and they're operated by electrical signals called an action potential, which operate when the level of chemical neurotransmitters in the brain reaches a certain level, and it fires a signal down an axon to a whole pattern of neurons connected by little dendrites. And the brain is constantly changing. It's called plasticity of the brain. So a thought, a new behaviour, will cause some connections to form with electrical impulses. If we keep repeating that thought or behaviour, those connections become firm, such that we're able to do that without any conscious energy. So you can quite see that if you have a negative thought, and that you think that negative thought on a regular basis, the pattern of negative thinking becomes part of unconscious processing. Yeah? The good news is it works well for remedies as well, so that's not all a bad thing. Now, the key hormones that are involved in stress, we'll just bring to your attention now, is dopamine. Dopamine runs on the pleasure-pain motivation pathway. So that's the carrot and the stick, absolutely to do with motivation. We've got norepinephrine, which is the attention stimulator. That's to do with levels of concentration and focus. And we have serotonin, which is the mood enhancer. When you're feeling happy and fulfilled, your brain is flooded with serotonin. Okay? So what is stress? Stress is actually the response of the body to an external stimulus. And the body responds in different ways. It's looking always for the best way of responding to this external stimulus. So a stress trigger sets off an alarm signal. The brain then floods with adrenaline, which to focus the response. and a hormone called cortisol. Then the body seeks some way of responding, and it's different in different people at different times. And in doing so, other hormones in the body and in the brain fall. So we deplete our levels of useful hormones. So that pattern is repeated until the level of resources in the body and the brain fall and are become depleted. We start to feel exhausted and the body needs to repair. Yeah? Now that cycle can be, you know, 1 or 2 off, or it can be repeated over time. But our response to stress may vary in different circumstances. So in one day, we get a response which is, well, that's okay, not too bad. On another day, it might have a bigger impact on us because of the way our brain chemicals are in any given time. So it's quite a complex subject. So what do the stress hormones do? In principle, what we're talking about here is our autonomic nervous system, which operates deeply at unconscious level. And it stimulates the fight or flight or freeze response. And it's got 2 systems going, which are continual flux and flow. The adrenaline fuels the sympathetic nervous system, which is like our accelerator. And at its extreme, it focuses our attention, makes the blood flow to our muscles, stops our digestive system, so we get tunnel vision. That's the extreme. And the body has a corresponding calm, rest and digest system called the parasympathetic system, which is fueled by something called acetylcholine. Now, we've related this directly to Myers-Briggs, so if you have an extroverted preference, you like more adrenaline in your system. If you have an introverted preference, you like more acetylcholine in your system. But it's not an either-or, because each person will have a point of balance called homeostasis, which works for them. And it's about maintaining this point of balance, which means that we can work at our optimum level. Now, we're fluctuating continually, but if we know some remedies that bring us back to the point of balance quickly, then our performance can maintain over a period of time and improve. Does that make sense? Yeah? So, it's like accelerator and braking system. And because of that, because we're in a continual state of flux, and it's going on outside our conscious awareness, what happens is our emotional state, the feedback to our body and our brain, occasionally becomes at a conscious level, and we start to talk about how we're feeling. Feeling a bit curious, feeling a bit skeptical, feeling a bit tired, feeling a bit hungry, given it's nearly lunch. Yeah? And our feelings range along a continuum from extreme excitement to a little bit of, bit of a thrill, to slight nervousness. I might be feeling that right at the moment, talking to a group of people, I don't know. But, you know, it's exciting, I'm interested in the subject, so I'll go back up to the, this is interesting. Yeah. Or if we go down the spectrum to start feeling anxious, and the anxiety builds and builds, we can end up feeling depressed. Yeah? So we're going like this all the time. And sometimes you find a mood is where you're sort of more at one end of the spectrum than another. Yeah? So a mood is sort of these feelings over a long period of time. So it can be quite difficult to spot. Yes? Now, what the stress hormones do is, because the body is looking to respond to the stress very quickly, it uses up our resources, it has a residual effect. So it's quite easy to think about this in terms of sporting people. So an athlete running a race, gets a huge surge of adrenaline focusing to their muscles, and as they're, for example, running around the track, something called lactic acid builds up in their muscles. So at the end of the race, they've got a clear sign, the panting, the feeling aching in the muscles, so they know they have to rest. We don't always spot that in the workplace. We're not necessarily spotting the signs that our resources are being depleted. So if we don't spot the signs, and stress is then repeated, for example, in a long period of change, or maybe anyone here gone through a process of redundancy with the uncertainty, what is going to happen? Yeah? So the stress triggers are repeated on a daily basis. So over time what happens is that the level of chemicals in the brain changes, and sometimes it gets to be almost like a permanent state. And what happens then, even though short-term stress can be exhilarating, because it's the adrenaline rush, over a long period of time, when we have a build-up of cortisol, the level of other hormones in our blood and our brain fall. And in fact, some of the connecting tissues on our neurons, these little dendrites, actually die in part of our brain to do with memory in the hippocampus. So we forget things. There is some research to suggest that we can reconstitute these cells. So that's hopeful, but that's just sort of fairly new. Our parasympathetic system, the rest and digest system, isn't operating enough. So we can often suffer indigestion, digestive problems, leading to ulcers. I hope I'm not depressing you too much with all of this. Dopamine is depleted, so we just can't feel the energy and the motivation to do things. So we lose interest in things that we felt passionate about before. That's because we haven't got enough dopamine in our system. And the norepinephrine levels fall. So we lose concentration, we lack focus. Sometimes you find yourself, if you're feeling stressed, doing something completely unimportant and irrelevant because you don't have to think too hard to do it. Right? So we lose focus, for example, at work. And serotonin is depleted, and this is the one that's affected most in depression, and it's treated by drugs that slow down the uptake of serotonin in the brain, because the brain wants serotonin and it uses it up very quickly, and we haven't got enough to make us feel happy. Yeah? That leads to depression. So I hope you're not feeling too bad at the moment, too uncomfortable. I'm going to pass you over to Jackie. She's going to talk about the things that you can do about it.
Well, I just had a thought, actually. We've been standing for nearly 2 days opposite some very nice gentlemen from Bupa.
Yes.
And you may be that you all marched down to the Bupa stand and signed up for private health, just in case. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, you might need to just back so they can see my name. I'm going to talk a bit about our response to this, because, okay, so there's a pretty important case around stress. So we decided to do 2 things. We decided that we would do our own research into values, and more of that later. And we decided that we would do that on the platform of MBTI. So could you put your hand up if you've used MBTI? So there's a really, really good understanding and awareness of MBTI already. I know it has its detractors, but there's a good solid footprint. And what we noticed actually was that people would say, yes, I've done my MBTI, but can't remember it, or it sort of didn't stick. Okay. So we think that the number of applications that you can use MBTI probably needs extending. So anyway, we decided that we would explore this further, not actually, I have to say at that time, just because of the stress and resilience implications, because of all sorts of other things to do with influencing skills development, etc., and motivation. So we asked thousands of people, what's important to you about this preference? What's important to you about your temperament? And what you discover there is, in a sense, the why people have the preferences, the benefits they perceive it brings them. So this piece of work we carried over of development work we carried over a number of years, and we've been using it in a pretty robust sense now for some time. So we have a good understanding of values for each type. Then the second thing we decided to do was to build on the already pretty good research into stress and management of stress associated with MBTI, which is often people haven't come across it, but it's very good. So, and what we're able to do there is to link the 2 things together, because there were sort of remedies for stress suggested, but when you understand it in the context of values, those remedies make sense and other remedies become available to people, because they're sort of working it out from principles rather than just following a list. Does that make sense? So just to remind you, in terms of MBTI, you're really looking at 4 preferences here. And we worked particularly with a professor of neuroscience to try and understand what is the connection in the brain between these preferences. Because people recognise a sort of right and left-handedness preference, and clearly that's coming from some usage of the brain. So whilst there hasn't been a great deal of academic research into this, there have been lots of papers produced where you can make a pretty good working hypothesis. So this professor was prepared to create some working hypotheses. If anybody wants to be guinea pigs, I'm sure she'll put the hat on and scan your brain if you like. But anyway. So the 4 preferences to do with energy sources, and Randy's already mentioned the adrenaline acetylcholine balance. sensing and intuition, which is using different parts of the brain to sort of recognise and process information, the thinking and feeling, decision-making preference, and then finally the thing about the external world and that dreaded thing called time, okay, which some of you enjoy and some of us don't enjoy, okay. You know who you are. So those are the 4 preferences. So what I'm going to do is actually explain some of the dynamics behind it. And again, apologies if you already know this, but what it enables you to do is to describe what's going on for an individual as a working model. Now, we decided we would use the example of an ESTJ. So does anybody have an ESTJ preference in the room that they would declare? Okay, thank you. Okay. Actually, we chose ESTJ because it is one of the most frequent profiles in a population. Okay. So I guarantee you will know an ESTJ. You're almost certain to have met and worked alongside ESTJs. They're lovely people, by the way. I hope you don't get the idea that we've got a downer on them. Okay.
All types are valuable.
All types are valuable. My father's an ESTJ, and he's great. Okay. So, what this system actually uses is a model. So here we go. Here are the 4 preferences. Can you see that? Okay. Am I in anybody's way? Sorry. Okay. 4 preferences. Now, the key ones for this area of stress are actually the mental functions. So a way of absorbing information and a way of making a decision. And everybody has a preferred way of doing that. You know, you need both parts of it in order to, as a human being, to function. So, what the theory and the research suggests is that there is a dynamic flow of energy around this system. So, for example, in the case of an ESTJ, and it's slightly different for each type, but here's a good example. The dynamic flow there is in the decision-making preference. So if we scanned the brain of an ESTJ, the part of the brain that will be processing tough logic would have a lot of blood supply going into it. Okay. And a lot of the conscious and unconscious energy is actually focused in that area. So what you see in terms of an ESTJ is a decision made quickly with a high degree of certainty that is instantly out there in the open. So they tell you what's on their mind, they tell you their opinions, and because it's done in the extroverted, their preferred area, okay. So there are not that many shades of grey for an ESTJ. I envy them, actually, the clarity that they have. And that is actually put into practice quickly in the judging preference. So they want to execute their decisions. They have a very scheduled and controlled way of doing it. So it's decide, do, decide, do. And if there are ESTJs in the room, when that flow it's taking place in an unimpeded way, there's a high degree of satisfaction and enjoyment. Yeah, would you agree with that? Okay. And it's really great. Now, to inform those decisions, because they're not made lightly, these decisions, although they're made quickly, is a whole store of internal detail. So they have a memory for facts, a memory for processes, for methods, procedures, for experience, which is marshalled into a decision and out it comes. Okay? You're nodding, so you recognise that. So the great thing about this work is that actually people, if you're describing their way their dynamic flow works in a good way, recognise it instantly. It expresses the way they have experienced their own world. And it's the same for all types. Now, most people have chosen to develop some other sort of non-preferred behaviours in a conscious way. So in the case of ESTJs, usually, very frequently, they have chosen to go into the sort of big picture area of thinking. And what that actually does is it enables them to put this really highly energetic decision-making energy in the context of more strategic goals. Do you agree with that? So even more loveliness, okay? Great. So, because all your energy is flowing in the brain in this lovely, lovely way, there is often an area of preference that is not used very much, because it's a bit like having a strong right arm. If you can actually do something, I didn't mean to get like that point, but you know, if you can do that, why would you do that? Okay? So, what that leaves is an area of preference, and each type has a tendency to have a least preferred way of behaving that is known as your jolly old inferior function. Okay? Now, how's that for making you feel bad as a label? But anyway, here it is. So in the case of an ESTJ, when they are exhibiting signs of extreme stress, what is more noticeable about them is that they are relying upon or using an unfamiliar part of their brain. So for most people in a high degree of stress, the extrovert-introvert thing is polarised. So E's become more silent and withdrawn, and I's can often have amazing outbursts, phenomenal outbursts.
She's experienced some.
Where you sort of, you jump back and think, okay. So it's a tad harder actually for introverts to hide it. Okay. Now, so the normal, robust and energetic and clear-minded and organised ESTJ is now demonstrating signs of sort of scuttling off a bit. Okay. Now, before that, they may have sort of demonstrate signs of anger, but will be withdrawing and feeling rather insecure, a little bit paranoid about relationships, very uncomfortable about these raging, boiling emotions that are unfamiliar that they're experiencing, and an extreme sense of loss of control. Put you on the spot, but is that? Absolutely. Okay. So when we are in these stress states, it is usually extremely uncomfortable because it isn't what we're used to. Okay. Is that making sense to people? Now, when you describe this process, people usually get it. Okay. We very rarely have people say, "Oh no, that's not me." Okay. And actually, if they say, "Oh no, that's not me," it's often because you haven't actually got their true type. Okay. So it is actually a differentiator in order, how do you recognise your true type? So we've already got a great deal of structure that allows you to get this magic thing called self-control. So what Mandy showed in one of the earlier slides was this spectrum of feelings can shift to a more constructive area as soon as the individual recovers a sense of control and understanding about what is going on. Okay, because with control and understanding it becomes an ability to cope. Okay, so not only can you say to somebody, here's the process you might have experienced, but it actually it makes them self-aware. And what we've done with a lot of organisations with this is actually people have adopted a sort of stress buddy, well, you don't want to call it that, but somebody they trust, because the next thing we're able to do is to give people very personalised hints and tips and descriptors of what would be a stress state for them. But before that, we're able to suggest things that might energise them. So, for example, if you're running a team of people and you know a person's energisers, guess what you can do? You can, tweak the workload or the distribution of tasks so that people are doing things that energise them as opposed to stressing them. Okay? And if you put them in a situation which they might find uncomfortable, you can do it in a controlled and planned way rather than by just accident. Okay. So, motivator stressors, things that are, and specific advice on things that will be highly stressful for individuals. So coming back to the ESTJ, it's not surprising that someone who wants to be implementing decisions will be stressed by what I would call ditherers. And you know who they are, okay? Ditherers. And actually, the ditherer could be somebody who has a very different decision-making style, which is slightly more internalised. So let's take the polar opposite, an INFP, functioning in a very different way with the brain energy, and you often find conflict just because there's a sign of misunderstanding. Yeah? Okay? All right. Yeah. Do you know, that's very interesting.
We're both trained.
Oh, good.
So
Thank goodness for that.
Interesting discussion.
Yes. Well, I did share some personal information earlier on. I've been divorced twice actually, and I'm happily married now, and it's thanks to MBTI. So I've got a bit of, I'm quite passionate about this as a topic. So very personalised tips for how to recognise signs of stress and what to do about it. Okay. So you're back in control, and if any of you, we met and see some familiar faces, got your hints and tips, we're going to email them to you. Hopefully you recognise that, and there's hope out there. Okay. So, coming back to the other bit that I talked about, the values stuff. Values are absolutely the crown jewels. So, this diagram, some of you might recognise, it's called logical levels. And it's a cracking diagram. I love this diagram. And so I'm going to describe it purely in the context of sort of stress today, but it has other applications. So when you look at it, just imagine that the point at the top, or the things at the top of the diagram, are most significant in terms of their ability to both motivate or create stress for individuals. So for example, at the identity level, if somebody comes up to you and says, do you know, you're a real role model for me. I really admire the way you do things. So just imagine someone said that to you. It's a non-specific thing, but it's cracking, isn't it? Okay. And how many of you are trying to create role model leaders? Yeah? Great feedback, because it's identity level positive feedback. However, if somebody comes to you and says, I'm very disappointed in you. I don't think you're a team player. You've let everybody down. You're a control freak. You're a wuss. You're not visible enough. Okay? And I have to say, these are all things that people have been happily told in official appraisal situations. Have you had these experiences? People come to you and said, he's cool, he said this to me. It's actually an organisational gossip sometimes, by the coffee machine. Okay? Now, these are identity level descriptions. Now, it may be what some people are concluding, but because it's attacking the person's whole identity, it's very significant, and it has the impact of enraging people or demotivating people. Okay. Now, underneath all of that are the values. So, for example, imagine if you valued innovation and you valued your courage. So, what you wanted to do was to, take new decisions for the business and lead it in new ways, even if it was high risk. You had the guts to do it. And you're able to do it, that's great. But somebody then starts to say, well, your ideas are stupid. You're unprofessional, you're irresponsible. So you couldn't actually carry out the things that you value highly. Then that's when stress levels are going to rise. Now, I'm not saying that the person's judgment is good. I'm just saying that they'll be stressed if they can't carry out the things that they value. Okay, so this is not sort of working on any external assessment of individuals. Okay, it's what's going on inside. So everybody has a personal hierarchy of values that drives their behaviour and causes them to feel resilient and upbeat and all those mood enhancer things that Mandy described. But if they're challenged, will start to sort of niggle and upset. So you may find somebody who is in an enraged state because of a trivial incident. Has anybody had that experience? And you think, well, get a life, get a grip. What's going on here? Well, that's a very good sign that some small behaviour or method or something in a context has happened that is threatening one of their highly valued values. And just because you don't necessarily experience it the same way, that is just a sign that you don't have the same value system. Yeah? So once you start to understand the relationship between behaviour and value, you're actually understanding more about how people process logically. We call this emotional logic. So coming back to the ESTJ, here is a picture of we call pyramids of values, hierarchies of values, of the emotional logic of an ESTJ. Okay. And with some attempt at hierarchy, actually, that in talking to people, they have prioritised that over that, so they would explain it. So here we are. Remember, the ESTJ loved to take decisions, and their brain energy was actually comfortable taking those decisions, and it was all flowing beautifully, etc., etc. So the most notable value, and sometimes called trademark or hallmark for an ESTJ, is decisiveness. So the worst thing you can do is impede that ability to decide, hence the ditherer comment. I've said it because ESTJs, so many have said to me, I hate ditherers. Okay. But, you know, the dither is in their eyes, not in anybody else's eyes. One person's patience is another person's dithering and faffing. Okay. Now, in support of all of that, here are the temperament values. Temperament's fantastic stuff. There are only 4 temperaments. So here are the temperament values of an ESTJ. Taking responsibility for stuff. Sorry, I keep looking at you because you've owned up. Working hard. Utilising their experience. Stabilising things. And here are the sort of preference values, and the hiding emotion, consistency and tough truth is the dominant preference. So again, that's something that they're not going to trade as easily. Okay. So what these values enable people to do is to understand what's driving that individual. Okay. So if somebody's experiencing a bit of discomfort or anxiety or frustration, often is what they will say, I'm frustrated about something, and you can see it, then what this system, if you like, enables you to do is to pinpoint the thing that's an issue. So is it the fact that I've taken a decision and actually what I can't do is get the organisation to adopt methods and processes that are right for that decision? Is that the issue? Or is it the case that I'm not in control of the implementation? Is that the thing that's frustrating me? Or maybe I can't, I'm trying to share that around the organisation and I haven't got an opportunity to communicate what my plans and goals are. They may not have an audience. They may be a sole contributor and actually want other people to get involved. So what you're able to do with your personalised pyramid of values is start to say, look, that's the thing that's at issue, or a colleague can do it for you. Okay. So in an overwhelming state, you're able to start to get back into balance and control and start to reason, vocalise and negotiate. Because you've got an understanding, you've got an analytical tool and framework to understand what's going on. Okay. You can aggregate these sorts of things up into culture, particularly at the temperament level. So you can see whole organisations in a particular culture. We've done some work with a large organisation. We've worked with their project managers and leaders globally. And 85% of the people through the programmes, which is hundreds of people, by the way, have an ESTJ preference.
Or ISTJ.
Or ISTJ preference. 85% in that company's culture. You know, so just imagine what that means about the organisation's culture. Okay? So that's been interesting in terms of one of the tools and techniques, and some of you have actually had a look at your own already. Okay, Wendy?
So just to see how you can use this in practice to maintain emotional balance, so the point of homeostasis for each person. When you're looking at influencing or praising people, motivating them or getting agreement, you get the biggest hit in terms of brain chemistry if you link it to something that's really important to them, one of their key values. Because you get a hit of serotonin, you get a hit of dopamine, your cortisol levels are reduced, so you get to be in a more resilient and high-performing state. So, for example, for an ESTJ, you'd say something like, what I saw you do well in that last meeting was you got to the core of the decision really quickly and you put a plan together which we're going to be able to implement. So we're going to achieve our goals this month. Yeah. Big yes. And if you're looking at changing behaviour, solving a problem, or you've got some performance issue to discuss with someone, you bring it down to the most specific level of change possible, minimum amount of change for maximum impact, in order to minimise the level of stress or resistance that person will feel in that situation. So another ESD example, you might say, you notice that they're making decisions a bit too quickly and their team members are feeling ignored and not consulted. And you don't want to say you're not a team player, because that's not very nice. What you'd say is something like, when you're making a decision, what would help you achieve your goals quicker and get a more robust implementation plan is if you asked a few more questions of your colleagues to make sure they understood what's required of them so they've got clarity and you can get their buy-in to your decisions. So you're asking for a behaviour change, but you're linking the doing of it to something that's important to the person so they're motivated to do it and they're not stressed by the things you're asking them to do. All right? Because words can be weapons. We can create stress by using the wrong type of words. And the more you know about different types, the more you remember key factors about these people, and you talk in that way. All right? That's how you use it. We call this maintaining emotional balance. So just quickly to summarise then, the techniques that we recommend you use to maintain a level of performance, to minimise stress and maximise your resilience, reassuring people by giving them clarity about what's expected of them, enables them to focus, causes the rest and digest system to kick in. So we get acetylcholine, we start to calm down. Demonstrating feedback, linking to something that's important to the person, and showing some empathy about the situation, releases chemicals called endorphins, also released when you take exercise. So that's another link. Working in a close team where you feel trusted and some connection to other people releases a chemical called oxytocin, and this is the bonding chemical. This is where you get when a team is really pulling together. And it's also the chemical that is the bonding chemical between parent and child. So sometimes what we notice in ESTJs is when they have a family, they become a bit more touchy-feely because it's the oxytocin in the system. Fulfilling your values, being able to work in an environment, do things which actually give you a direct hit of serotonin because they're linked to your key values, hugely useful as a technique for minimising stress and increasing resilience. And motivating yourself or motivating others by linking goals to their individual values increases the flow of dopamine. That's what engagement's all about, I think, employee engagement. So, look for opportunities to apply your beliefs and values appropriately and pay attention to working in a way that fulfills your values. Now, it's not always possible, but it's about being aware of the period when you can't do that. It will have some impact on you and your performance. So make sure that in some area of your life you're able to fulfill your values by doing things that are rewarding for you. So in summary, be brain aware of your own brain. Notice your own state. Pay more attention to what's going on internally. And if you know your own preferences or someone else's, share that information with one another so you can spot the signs of stress in one another. Understand your own personal values, hugely important in maintaining motivation, and focus on using constructive language of values to motivate people, specific feedback about things you want them to do differently, very specifically, constructively. If you're precise and specific about problems, what you're able then to do is maintain this balance of perspective, which we all require to perform at our best. And if you show empathy for other people, so showing that you understand the situation they're in and you're aware of what they're feeling, not how they're feeling, because you won't know, then what that enables the individual to do is to feel better able to cope, better resourced to solve the problem themselves, which is what resilience is all about, the ability to cope under pressure. So just to close, if you do want to spend a bit of time looking at your own Myers-Briggs, come to our stand at 7. We'll happily go through a quick diagnostic with you, and we'll then be able to show you your personal stress triggers and remedies, and we can email them to you afterwards. So anybody got any questions before we close off? Good, 5 minutes for questions. The lure of lunch is powerful. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming along. It's been a great pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you.